and welcome back to Medicine for These Times. I'm so happy to have Alexander Beiner back with us to discuss his it's not necessarily a new book anymore, but a book that was not out when he was on this podcast previously. And we're going to get into DMT and Sensemaking in the world. Alexander, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Beth. Good to be back.
I'm excited to talk to you now that the book has been published and your work has been blowing up to a whole next level, especially with the DMT videos on Instagram, which we'll talk about. So Alexander is an author, journalist, and facilitator. He's the author of the new book, The Bigger Picture: How Psychedelics Can Help Us Make Sense of the World, and writes a popular Substack focused on making sense of culture, philosophy, and spirituality. He's an executive director of Breaking Convention, a charity that puts on Europe's longest running conference on psychedelic medicine and culture. So, Alexander, we won't get into your background, like your upbringing and how you got here.
Great.
But let's talk about this new book and what you've been up to since publishing it. You made a shift from letting go of rebel wisdom and went kind of all in with this book around psychedelics. Yeah, what has happened since then? You've made this book round on a lot of podcasts, and then you've been doing these great DMT videos on Instagram. What's it been like since publishing this new book?
Yeah, what's it been like? I often don't stop to sort of reflect because it's been quite fast paced, especially at the beginning, especially it came out in June 2023. So it's it's not even a year yet, so it's still very much in the process of getting it out there and giving it wings to go wherever it might need to go. So I've been writing a lot, really. I write probably about two, 3 pieces a month on my Substack. So I've been doing what I love to do, which is writing about what's going on in the world and the sort of deeper levels of what's happening in culture in what is a really crazy time to be alive. That's for me. That's part of it is sort of trying to diagnose what's going on and speaking to really, smart people who are really good at that as well. And then perhaps more interesting is figuring out, well, what do we do? How do we make it through the times we live in? And where does psychedelics fit into that? Because I think they have a really important role to play. And that's what my book is about. It's really, instead of how to change your mind, it's how to change culture. And that's obviously a much more complex topic. It's not as simple as everyone just takes psychedelics and then we'll all sing Kumbaya and it'll all be great. It's a lot more complex. I think what psychedelics can help us do is to develop new ways of seeing and being, new ways of thinking. I think the actual lesson of the psychedelic experience itself is in the experience rather than necessarily the insights we might gain, which might be very personal and might be very context dependent, even though they are very important and can be life-changing. If we're looking at the collective level of like, okay, well, how do we solve what are called wicked problems in the study of complexity? There's complex problems. There's complicated problems, which is like, how do you fix a car engine? It's got like limited, it's doable if you just know how the engine works. Then there's complex problems like, how do you fix a society? Actually, that's probably even more so than how do you fix climate change would be like a wicked problem. Arguably, how to fix society is also wicked. And wicked means we don't know. We don't have solutions to these problems, which is a great place to start from when you're looking at psychedelics. Starting from I don't know is one of the healthiest approaches. So I'm very interested in I'm working in a few projects looking at how psychedelics can lead to innovation and creativity. I'm really interested in that. I'm really interested in psychedelics for conflict resolution. I haven't done any of that work, but I've done cultural conflict resolution work non-psychedelically, so getting people to talk about difficult polarizing cultural topics like COVID, vax, anti-vax, and sort of gender politics. So I'm really interested in what's the role that psychedelics could play in helping us to have those conversations in a new way and connect and empathize with each other in new ways. So it's an exciting time, actually. There's a lot of potential that we all have right now.
Wow. I personally find that to be one of the most fascinating aspects of why psychedelics have grown in popularity at this time is, it's not a coincidence that our world seems to be in utter chaos, and it's probably only going to get, more interesting, as I like to put it. Try not to really say what's good or bad, but you speak of sense making, and it's been interesting to explore this notion of making sense of the world. Because on such a deep level, it's I've been inquiring into this, probably as have a lot of psychonauts out there, people that just like to think very deeply of like, why are we even alive? What is this all about? On some level, it's this illusion, as we kind of know, and it's hard to grasp, and maybe it's not because we're still functioning in reality. But then, who's to say what's right or wrong, or who's to say what's real or not real? Especially as we get into this world of, AI generated everything. The media, I don't know if anybody trusts anything anymore. We don't actually know what's right or wrong, even though we might think like, well, that makes more sense and that doesn't. But how do you even make sense out of this notion of sense making?
Mm.
Like that's where I'd like to start. And then we'll get into how the psychedelics can help us navigate this time. But have you ever explored this kind of deeper sense of the fact that maybe there's nothing to make sense out of?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the question of our age. This is the problem. This is why sense making is something that people are interested in, why it's important. It's not everything, though. I'll get to that. Like, basically, we live in a time where the idea of truth has become hyper relative, and sometimes truth is relative, but also sometimes truth is absolute. So you can't have anything that's always relative, because even that's an absolute. If you say truth is always relative, then you just made an absolute statement, right? So it's impossible to get away from absolutes. It's impossible to get away from binaries. You can have a lot of movement within those absolutes and binaries, but this is, in my view, a fundamental way that the universe is structured, down to the quantum level, where possibly we live in a relational universe where at the quantum level things arise because of their difference to other things. That's the wisdom of Taoism. It's how this technology works with ones and zeros. It's how digital technology works. I think it's a fundamental aspect of reality, and it's true. So we have some foundation of which to start trying to orient ourselves in the world. If nothing is true, there's absolutely no hope. You human beings can't thrive like that. And what happens, and no one does work like that, because what happens and what's happened in culture, in a situation where we're getting the message, nothing matters, the universe is a dead machine, and everything is relative, we're post-truth. What happens is that people cling even more tightly to perceived certainties. So ideology, politics, fandoms, people connect really intensely with anything that's going to give, we have this obsession with identity. And part of the reason for that, I think, is because when you strip away anything more meaningful than um, us, ourselves, which is what both psychology and capitalism focus on very intensely. Who are you as an individual? What matters to you? What's your personalized version of utopia? All of that is profound. It creates a profound cultural narcissism, and drives us kind of mad. So the emptiness that people feel, the disconnection that people feel, is a disconnection that comes from not being connected to something greater than ourselves, even an ideal. So in that sense, that's just to kind of caveat it. And then, well, what does sense making mean then from that? Sense making is like a dynamic process of understanding what's going on, but it's not like understanding in the sense that if I understand something, I get it, right? I know how tides work, right? I kind of do. I know it involves the moon, right? Let's say I'm a tidal scientist, and I really have studied that. I know how tides work, right? That's like an understanding. Sense making is different, because sense making is a continuous process of orienting ourselves in the world and figuring out, okay, who and where am I, and to the best of my ability, how can I perceive what's going on well? Now, psychedelic experiences force us to get better at sense making in many ways, I think, because there is so much going on. There's so much content. There's so much complexity. There's so much nuance. There's so much discernment required to really get something out of a psychedelic experience. And one of the arguments I make in my book is that the internet is effectively a psychedelic realm. And so when we're going into the internet, and increasingly with things like, the Apple Vision Pro, where we have augmented reality, where reality itself is overlaid with your version of reality, whatever you want that to be, or whatever you've personalized for yourself. That is a mad place to be. And that's a place that no other human beings, to my knowledge, have been in before because they didn't have that technology. And so we've always had altered states, but now we have this kind of altered state realm that everyone can access and everyone goes into. And it's, of course, a total mess. It's a total mess. No one knows what's true. Like you were saying, no one knows what's true. No one knows who to trust. No one really trusts anything. Everything's kind of a grift or a con, or almost everything is. Everyone's trying to sell something. Everyone's trying to buy something. It's a total mess. That's partly because of how those social networks are designed as well, right? So, part of what we need, I think, as well, is to come back to the body, which is real. The every single thing that you are making sense of, think of the word sense in sense making, it comes from your senses. There's nothing that you will ever experience, think, say, do, no position you'll hold politically or anything like that is not coming through your body. It's all coming through the body. And we know from cognitive 4E cognitive science that it's called 4E because it argues that our cognition is embodied, extended, enacted, and embedded. So it means that we're not just a brain in a body. We're embodied. Like everything we think is relies on having a body. You can't think and be a being without a body. So it's also enacted in that our thinking is also inextricable from doing stuff in the world. Like, okay, I moved this rock over here and I've impacted my environment, and now I have a new environment to deal with, right? That's sense making. It's like, okay, what am I going to do now that this rock is over here from over here? From this very simplest level, like we're always doing it. And we're also embedded in our environment, right? Like a whale only makes sense in the ocean, doesn't make sense in a football field, right? It's not really a whale anymore. It's only a whale in the ocean. We're only human beings when we're embedded in a particular social matrix. And when we get out of that, we see what we're seeing now. We see like young people not leaving their rooms, just, focused on like extremely online. A lot of young men just playing video games or watching porn and not having relationships. Young people increasingly not going out. Like there's a lot of news stories here in the UK this week about young people aren't going to bars and clubs anymore. And there's like hundreds of bars and clubs closing. They'd rather stay home or go to the gym or just be really wholesome. They're not drinking as much. They're not having sex as much. So there's a whole conversation around that going on, and it's, in part a response to the environment that they're in, which was created also in part by tech companies and by, I would say, by late stage capitalism itself. So we don't do well when we're not embedded in a community and connected with other people and risking our bodily safety every now and again, doing stuff that pushes us to the edge, get into a flow state, connecting with the wider environment, being in nature. We don't do well. If we were meant to live the kind of lives we're living, we'd all be super happy and we wouldn't need psychedelics for a mental health crisis. It'd be like, great. But obviously that's not where we find ourselves. Yeah.
Wow, there's so much to unpack here. Because I will preface this by saying I read Jules Evans sent a new article out, I think this morning or yesterday, but I finally read it before this interview about an hour ago, about people who have pretty bad psychotic breaks on psychedelics and get to the point of murder. And of course that's a whole separate conversation. We all know alcohol has the same thing, and it could just be the world that we're in. I don't think we can't blame psychedelics, but when I feel into this and I think, oh well, maybe the answer to these kids who are so disconnected, maybe it would be sitting in a mushroom ceremony or an ayahuasca ceremony and getting to know themselves. But then you know we all know that these psychedelics, especially one that you've been speaking about a lot, the notion of a DMT journey, right? Whether it's ayahuasca or with DMT, they can actually make a lot of people worse, right? There's a lot of
Yeah.
this, just the world that we're in, and then people who are already so disconnected from self, from their bodies, and then they get some really intense non-ordinary state, and it's like, okay, maybe this will help, maybe it'll make them worse. But I'm curious, how do you see psychedelics fitting into this culture, this world, this disconnected society of, as we all see that it's like there's so many of these world's problems. Like, do you feel that they are actually here to help in some positive way, or do you think it's going to be like anything, where there's always going to be the quote positive and the quote negative aspect of psychedelics becoming so popular? I mean, I'm in Austin right now, and I've been here for a week and a half, and it's just mind blowing to hear the level of, someone next to me in yoga saying they're going on a 3 month training to become a shaman.
Mm.
It's everywhere here. It's like really into the culture, at least the places where I've been going. You think this is positive or negative? Like, where's this gonna go in the future here?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think both. I think positive and negative. I think that whole trend of people thinking they can train to be a shaman is absurd a lot of the time, and not unexpected, because if you live in a culture that says you're special, you can do anything you want, nothing can stand in your way, it's very different from an initiatory culture that a lot of cultures, not just, the word indigenous is a tricky one because everyone's indigenous to somewhere, but there's a lot of cultures who've used psychedelics have had some form of initiation. Our cultures used to have forms of initiation into adulthood, for example, where there's a great podcast called The Emerald, where there's a great AI episode people should check out, where it talks about this with AI.
Really recommend that one.
Yes,
Very
absolutely.
good. Yeah.
And so, as he points out in that, like having anything kind of powerful usually requires some kind of training and initiation into it. Now, then the question becomes, in our society, who's going to initiate people? And of course, we don't have that. We don't have the elders who are going to initiate people. So, and a lot of the people who have been taken psychedelics and have really dedicated their lives to that, and just people who are interested in psychedelics I didn't have anyone initiating me. I just took mushrooms with some friends in a park, and then I was like, oh. And pretty much everyone, I mean, most people I speak to have had some version of this experience. And then some people go, well, that was an interesting experience, I might not do that again, or might do it a few times. And then some people like us probably go, oh my god, I must know more. I'm not going to know more about this. It's incredible. I was definitely one of those people. And so for me, I guess I had to do kind of a self initiation and had to go through the ups and downs and trials and errors and, real pain as well as lots of joy of trying to figure out how best to use these very powerful, very sacred substances and medicines and molecules. So I think the answer, well, one of the answers I keep coming back to, and one of the reasons I'm a director of a educational charity, is education. It's like, if we can, that's what I did. There was Erowid. I was on an internet forum called the Grow Report. This is in like 2007, 2008, 2009 kind of era. So it was like pre-social media, or just like very early social media. But I had just made such wonderful connections with people, talking about psychedelics, talking about philosophy, talking about ego death, talking about, it's quite a supportive thing. We'd meet up in person in the Netherlands once a year. And like, it was lovely, really formative for me. I think we need communities of practice like that, and they are forming. People are doing that, but we need to continue, I think, to put out the message that you're not a shaman if you've done a 3 week or 3 month even retreat somewhere. You're just a person who doesn't know how much they don't know. By definition, you just don't know how much you don't know, right? After hundreds of hours of experience and good teachers, and of course the modalities that work for the Western mind, understanding therapy, doesn't mean everyone has to be a therapist, but understanding what are the dynamics of our mind. What have people spent years researching? Transference, countertransference, the relationship, positive regard, all these different aspects of like what it actually means to be with people. You need a basis in that before you're going to work with people with psychedelics. And then, even then, the attitude is not one of like, hey ho, I'm going to, every time I've run retreats, it's the thing that I've done that requires the most care, the most consideration. I have the most nerves because I'm like, this is such a huge responsibility. And it's also, facilitation wise, one of the most challenging things you can do, to have 12 people all in an altered state. You need to know what preparation are you giving people, how are you holding the space, how, Natasha Pelgrim, who I've worked with doing this, is just a master of that as well. It's just that whole holding that kind of space. And then we spent a lot of time as well, in preparation as well as integration, and the amount you have to really like think about it and have to have of your own experience and have to read the research and all of that. it's very doable. It just, you have to sacrifice. You just have to you have to take the time. So there's no shortcuts with psychedelics. They don't work like that. Yeah.
Ooh, thank you. This has come up a lot lately, actually. Someone I interviewed the other day, and then the week and a half that I've been here, I've heard a lot of horror stories,
Mm.
which is, as you say, it's like we have this culture that is, not to say, I don't even like to throw around the word narcissistic, because now everybody is a
Everyone's a narcissist.
narcissist,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
You
yeah,
have
of
a
course.
podcast, you're a narcissist. But there's a lot of ego and very little discernment, and I think it's that depth of disconnection to self, to the sense, and then you have this amazing psychedelic experience, and it's like, oh wow, I'm going to devote my entire life to this and go do a 3-week shaman training and then go serve people medicine, which I don't even know where they get the medicine at that point. But I have it's very interesting that in 10 days, I have now heard about 6 different psychedelic horror stories. Firsthand accounts, by the way,
Mm,
not just from Jules's amazing Substack,
yeah.
and it's been interesting. And I know we're going to hear more of this out there. Because again, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because I've even struggled with this myself, where I agree with you. I tend to be like the one that's deterring people from giving people medicines, because I do believe there is a certain level of training and understanding of working with your medicine, and even the basics of countertransference and transference,
Mm,
which seems like a lot of people don't understand, because most of the horror stories tend to be around that
mm,
and sexual assault
yeah.
and different sexual stories. But then someone said something to me previously this year, or last year, about, well, hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago, it's not like we had therapists giving each other mushrooms and, Mazatec culture. Or, my shaman who comes from the jungle, by the way, who doesn't even call himself a shaman. I do.
Mm,
It's like it was just in his culture. It was around, I know what his training was, it's been 35, 40 years, but and he had a master, but at the same time, there was no program, there was no certificate, there was no learning about transference, countertransference, and understanding the somatics and the energetics. It was, they went in, they worked with the medicine, they connected to it, they understood what was happening, and probably through lots of initiations, they became masters.
mm.
But what do you think is happening there? And what do you say to someone who says, like, well, because I have heard this argument over, well, if someone wants healing and they're not able to go on this $5,000 retreat to a country where it's legal and all they can afford is to buy some mushrooms and have their friends sit for them and hope that they cure their, treatment resistant depression with a few grams or whatever. Who's to say what's right or wrong? And there's times where I say, you know what,
Yeah.
maybe you are right. And if something terrible happens, that's the initiation, or it's part of life. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you ever wonder about?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. And I think it's an important distinction, because I think someone choosing to take mushrooms and having a friend sit for them is a very different thing to someone going out to the Amazon, quote, training as a shaman, and then coming back and offering medicine ceremonies for big groups of people. Firstly, because working with groups is completely different to working with someone one to one. And because if someone's sitting, they're not necessarily sitting as, hey, I'm your healer. There's a different dynamic going on. They're just like, hey, I'm your friend who's just going to be present with you. And that's a hell of a lot better than someone doing it just by themselves if they're not experienced. So I also like have time for the argument of like, I'm definitely not calling for this sort of like the rule of like psychiatrists and psychotherapists over the mind, because I think while there's a lot of really important insight from those worlds, they're by no means complete, and nothing should be like we shouldn't have a worldview forced on. I actually blame the psychotherapeutic sort of mindset for partly what the not the large part, but like definitely the rise of therapy speak and this obsession with our internal states. That's actually a deep cultural thing, but also psychology has definitely made it worse. Like you said, everyone who disagrees with you is a narcissist, and then everyone who doesn't like what you're saying is gaslighting you. All this stuff is just a total mess. So there's that bad side of it as well. And at the same time, I think look, like I'm for cognitive liberty for sure, and also for people to be very educated about, like, okay, how severe is the depression? What's really going on? Do they have some therapeutic or some kind of support? It could also be pastoral support. It doesn't have to be therapeutic. Do they have a priest or a rabbi or an imam or another, is there someone, a religious person they trust? What is it? Whatever it might be. It could be a parent. It could be someone who's just, is absolutely present and there for them. A lot of research in therapy shows that um, the most consistent factor in whether a therapy is successful isn't the type of therapy, like whether it's CBT or psychodynamic or somatic. It's the therapeutic relationship and the skill of the therapist. So it's like, if you have a mentor or a friend who's really there for you and can help, sometimes that's enough, So it's so highly contextual. Like, I feel like it's impossible to like make blanket rules, but I think it's a birthright for people to choose to alter their consciousness. Absolutely. And I think the problem comes with the hype, where, like, when I was getting into psychedelics, there wasn't this hype about, like, the medicalized hype, which is driven by those clinics and research organizations as well. Like, they drive the hype as much as the press do. And science is kind of the religion of our society. So if something has scientific backing, the media just like gobble it up, and they don't look at the complexity of it. They tend to be quite poor at that, on the whole. So in that sense, like, there wasn't this idea of like, this is going to heal me. This is the thing I need to heal whatever it is I'm struggling with. That understandable desperation that people come with, and then understandable, like, unfairness of looking at the landscape. You're like, okay, I can either sign up for a clinical trial and almost certainly not get on because they're so strict and there's so few of them, or I can go to this super expensive retreat center, which most of us can't afford, or if we can, it's really going to be like, it's going to really break the bank. And then where are we going to get our, therapy is already super expensive. Just having therapy is extremely expensive. Just regular weekly therapies, hundreds of dollars a month. So that I'm totally, definitely an advocate for really solid psychedelic education and giving the agency to people to make informed choices. But then people really have to figure out, okay, do I understand what I'm getting myself into with this experience? Have I got the right setting? Have I done enough preparation work? Have I got the right dose, crucially as well? And all of those elements. And by and large, I would say that once you get those things right, you are in a pretty good position to have some, certainly the potential for really transformative experiences. I would never want anyone not to be able to access that, and that's the beauty of, like, mushrooms, for example, is that anyone can really grow them. So yeah, it's very democratic.
Yeah, and there's so much here. I feel like I could talk to you for hours about this because there's so many nuances. Even what you said about the industry, right? Like the research, the science, the media, the therapy, the fact that a lot of this is inaccessible to just, everybody. And every time you say something, I'm like, well, it seems to come back to capitalism. Um, pretty much
Mm.
everything. And actually, that was going to be my next question is, I'm sure you know what's going on over here in the US with, Oregon and Colorado, and then there's decriminalized cities, and there's, well, I mean, everything going on in the psychedelic space, but, there's venture capital funds, there's investors dropping money in, maybe not as much as they were 2 years ago, but and it's interesting. I've had clients that have been on to help open Oregon's first service center, to be part of Oregon's first psilocybin therapy training programs, which you're not even allowed to call it therapy, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
um, because there's lots of rules and regulations. And it's been very fascinating. And I personally have had a lot of mixed feelings about it. Even these former clients of mine have had mixed feelings about it because, yes, it's legal in Oregon. You can go get psilocybin. I forgot what their official term is, but they don't call it therapy. But then there's these regulations. It's structured differently. They're even measuring it different than most of us are used to here in the
Mm.
U.S. The pricing is all over the place. The book of regulations, and it's also, the reality is everybody's a toddler, and no one really knows what they're doing with this because it's kind of this new world, even though it's ancient,
Mm.
of legal regulated psilocybin. how do you feel about that? Because, it's like, again, oh, this is so great. It'll just be legal everywhere. I'm a fan of cognitive liberty. I think these should have never been illegal in the first place. Obviously we can't turn back time, but what are your feelings around regulation? Again, capitalism basically coming into, let's say, plant medicine or mushrooms that one can just grow in their own home.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a huge question for me. And I did a lot of films around this when in 2020 when psychedelic capitalism was really booming. And I'm actually really pleased that a lot of the money has come out of the market because a lot of it was speculative. A lot of it was coming with the wrong intention. And I'm glad they got burned, frankly, because they had no business playing in the space to begin with. So I'm thrilled about that. So now we can slow down and look at, okay, well, how will this work? I mean, one of the things, yeah, I mean, this is an argument I make in my book, is that capitalism, or let's say civilization, but certainly capitalism, has a tendency to capture anything that could be a threat to it and then repackage it and sell it back to you, right? So we see that with social justice movements. We've seen it with yoga and meditation. And also there's always the real expressions of it. You'll always have an intelligent, thought out version of all those things that isn't very sellable because it's too complicated and people like it's not easy to package into in like an Instagram video, right? So it's basically or a brand's like new line of clothing. So it'll always be both. This is a point Kat Kanur, who was involved with the North Star Pledge, people might be aware of, was an ethics organization or kind of ethics collaborative that sprung up during during the big boom to figure out, okay, ask these questions. How can we have ethical approaches? And they did like an admirable job of trying to get a lot of people around the table. But the one thing is that you can't really push against that profit motive while still trying to play the game of the profit motive. Like you can't, like, in a way, it's going to eat everything unless you, in a sense, keep things hidden and secret. There's some kind of a degree of that. So that's a little bit more esoteric. But let's just practically in somewhere like Oregon. Look, I think humans, we are quite good at figuring stuff out when under pressure to do so, right? So I think there's a lot of people who are very passionate and care a lot about the psychedelic experience. A lot of it is driven by the love of the work. Like, it's not big money. Even when you're running retreats that look like they're quite expensive, it's not really big money. You make a lot more money doing a lot of other things, considering how many hours actually go into it. And so it's enough to make a living off of, but it's done from a different place. And most of the people I've seen who are doing it well, it's done from a place of like, it's a calling as much as anything else. It's a kind of work that needs to be a calling, I think, and of course that's really inconvenient for, say, a big pharma company, because what they want is people to be able to, like a machine, slot in and out. But that's not what psychedelics do. You can't pull one over on a psychedelic like that. People will feel the slightest level of fear or discomfort in a facilitator or someone sitting for them. The slightest gesture you cannot hide. Like, that's the thing. That's what, for me, psychedelics are defined by. You cannot hide. You can't hide from what you've been hiding from in yourself, and you will feel the vibe of everything that's going on. The choices of decor that they took, right? Like, is it a little bit bland and corporate? Well, when you're tripping, it's going to be so bland and corporate that it's going to become so obvious, right? You're going to have this, like, the magic of the experience will like reveal what was in the shadow of whatever it is. So I think with that in mind, like, it's possible for people to do this outside of the profit motive. Like, you can make profit, you can make money out of it. It doesn't have to be like all non-for-profit, but there's ways to do it that and part of it's around the supply. Where are the mushrooms coming from, which makes a big difference. If they all have to come from a pharma company, then everyone's kind of screwed, right? And what'll happen is that people just grow their own mushrooms, right? Yeah, I mean, it's like that's what should happen, because you can't patent psilocybin, for example. You can only patent a polymorph, which is just basically like a legal loophole, in my view. So really, it's about there's a whole question as well of ownership and agency that comes up, and it kind of is really fascinating what happens with psychedelics and capitalism, because it really asks some pretty hard questions, like who owns this? Like someone has to answer, like, oh, and of course the psychiatric establishment often jump up and say like, well, we own it because we're the highest ranking people who look at the mind, so this is our thing. And it's like, fuck off. No, it isn't. You can have a piece of it, but it's not your thing. Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard about this. I've just been told that someone in the US is trying to patent the word microdosing, or, well,
I
patent
didn't
the
know that.
system of microdosing psilocybin.
That's
Ugh,
outrageous. Yeah, that's so
yeah.
stupid. It's so stupid. I mean, like we saw that with it's quite difficult to patent a system, though. I wonder how they'll pan out because, like, Bikram yoga is patented.
Oh, God.
Yeah, because it's very specifically like these particular moves in this order with the
Yeah.
application of like this much heat or something like that. So it has to be very specific, and I hope they fail. Yeah.
And I will say, I had a friend that got injured in a Bikram class and spent about 15 years with ayahuasca trying to heal it.
Wow.
Obviously, not just with ayahuasca, but other things.
Yeah.
But well, let's get into the next section I want to ask about, because I could talk about. I mean, I'm laughing, but I'm crying on the inside, deeply,
Mm,
because it's been such a huge part of my life for over 30 years, and
yeah.
probably like you, it was like I had the teenage experience and went through so many different initiations, and these are so near and dear to my heart. And I had, it wasn't even a calling; it was just universe took me in this direction. All of a
Mm,
sudden, it was in front of my face. But and I do like to be optimistic and believe that it is all good. Everything's going to sort itself out. Nature always balances itself.
mm.
And, we have this kind of sick culture on so many levels. But I wanted to ask you about these DMT trials that you are a part of. They're so fascinating. I know we talked about them previously. You've written about it in your book. It's all over your Instagram. So first, I wanted to know, were you chosen to participate in this trial because of who you were, the platform you had, the experience you had? I would assume so, or was it
No,
just
no.
random?
It wasn't random, but it certainly wasn't like because of any of that. It's because I'm friends with Chris Timmerman, and he told me about it, and I just volunteered on the spot. I was like, yes. And then I really vividly remember walking away and being like, "Ooh, I don't know if I want to be injected with DMT for 40 minutes. That sounds kind of crazy." But I was like, "Yeah," but it was a curiosity. I was like, "No, I have to do it. I really want to."
Crazy.
So, but no, it was partly though those of us who were in the dose finding trial, which was I think 11 total, and then I think 9 ended up doing all of it. It's kind of cool, actually. I know like 3 or 4 of them. And then after the study, we kind of exchanged notes. But there's a bunch of I didn't know who was on it, which is kind of cool. Kind of curious if I can find out who that is now. But so yeah, so we were all pretty experienced psychonauts. That was the key thing. Like we all had a lot of psychedelic experience and a lot of experience navigating pretty intense psychedelic states, and that was kind of one of the prerequisites. It was very strict, the screening. Like, I had really no history of, I'm lucky I don't have a history of mental illness in my family, or any bipolar or psychosis. But even like family history anywhere was like no, was a no. Would have been like no. I had to get a no from my doctor, which was kind of hilarious. It's like, I'm
He's like,
doing
what is
a
this?
DMT trial. Yeah, I don't know, that they seem cool about it. I think because Imperial is very well respected, they were like, okay, whatever. It's a drug trial, whatever. So I had to do a lot of checks, physicals and making sure everything, heart rate and whatnot. So that was the main reason, was that, they were looking for people who were experienced, because we were like the guinea pigs for the guinea pigs. So what they were trying to figure out was what dose is, because it's kind of, I'm not a scientist, so I don't understand the dynamics of it, but I have a lot of respect for Lisa Luan and Chris Timmerman at Imperial for figuring this out, because they were like, okay, so the DMT is getting pumped into our bloodstream, right? And so what they were trying to do is keep us on a plateau of a peak for as long as possible, and then it would come down. So the first few dosings would go up, would kind of, I mean, when it was injected, it was incredibly intense, like smoking DMT. It was just like immediate state change. And then the buzzing ears, body stuff. I'd feel like I was like, oh, fuck, I have to pee, I have to pee, I have to pee. Just the anxious thoughts, just have to like hold all of that and just be with that and breathe. And then it would kind of go down after a few minutes for all of us. Actually, for all of us, it'd be like, whoa, and then we like adjust to the experience and be like, okay, all right, I'm good. And so what they wanted to do is keep us on that plateau, and then it would come off. And so like the first few dosings were, they were all strong, but they would sort of like come up and then like peak a little bit like further in, and then kind of come down. The last dosing, they really nailed it, because it really was like zoop, and then okay, and then down. So then that's what everyone else got after us. All the people who went in for one dosing, which was like the main study, they all got that dose that they figured out from dosing us. So, and it was really cool because they gave us an extra dose once they figured it out, which I'm sure they needed to do for science reasons, but it felt like a bonus. I was like, yes, amazing. So I had unfinished business as well. I kind of wanted an end to my, I had like, I got some closure for my last journey, but then actually I wanted, like, I felt like there was deeper to go, and the dose was higher, and it was, and we were peaking for longer. So it was really like one of the most amazing psychedelic experiences I've had, certainly.
I know I'm sitting here having like heart palpitations. I can't even imagine being in the DMT state nonstop for that long. But this is what I wanted to ask. What do you think was your biggest teaching, lesson, takeaway from those experiences, whether it's personally or for, on a larger scale? Because I know you would ask some kind of like, oh, help me with the world and the world's problems and help me make sense. And, like, especially being who you are and the voice that you have and the platforms that you have, it is always interesting what can come through these
Mm.
experiences. But I'm wondering, was there anything that we can hear about that was the most mind-blowing experience?
Yeah, I would say, like, I didn't come out with any sort of like, okay, we need to build this kind of solar panel and then we're going to save the world, right? I think very much the message that my experience gave me was, you guys have to figure it out, as in you being the human race. It's like, you got to figure your shit out, you got to grow and figure it out. There's no shortcuts. At the same time, I think in my final dosing, I had this, experience of being what I would describe as like an overview effect of being incredibly, like, the overview effect is something astronauts experience, seeing the Earth from space, and having a sense that I I was part of, or am part of, a vast ecosystem of intelligences that I don't understand, like this kind of rich, which, in many cultures, many indigenous cultures, is the worldview. It's like we are part of this incredibly beautiful, complex ecosystem of intelligence. That's the difference in the worldview that our societies run on, the metaphysics of it, like what we think is fundamental to everything else, is that the world is a lifeless dead machine, and that all human beings are just temporarily animated lifeless dead machines. That's basically the Enlightenment worldview. That's the scientific worldview that we have right now. I don't think it's true. I don't think it's scientifically true. A lot of scientists who have a more panpsychist or idealist view argue pretty strongly against that. And for me, what it led me to was like, because I'm always interested in, okay, what's driving these huge cultural forces that we're all struggling with? Is it culture? And I was like, yeah, okay, maybe it's culture. And then I was like, yeah, but okay, what generates culture? And then where I came to was metaphysics generates culture. Like, what we think reality is creates the kind of culture we have, fundamentally. And so if we have a sense of reality that is interconnected and alive, and the world is a place that's living, conscious, and we're part of it, and we're also conscious and part of it, that creates a completely different system and a completely different worldview. That's very much what I think is the case. So that led me on a really interesting intellectual path of, okay, well, which I cover at the end of the book as well, just to kind of trying to piece together, okay, well, what impact does it have? And we know from various psychedelic studies that people come out of psychedelics often with a more panpsychist view, as in they see the world as that consciousness is some fundamental part of the world. That's the key thing that we're missing, I think, because if the world is dead and everything is lifeless, why wouldn't we just destroy it? Why not? Like, what does climate change matter? What does anything matter? Right? So we have this like deep nihilism that comes with that. It's no way to live, and I don't think it's true. So that probably was really kind of a fundamental experience for me, and encountering just that many entities at the same time. It's part of it. Just see the sense of like, yeah, being, it's very humbling because I think the overview effect is a really good experience for the Western psyche, because no one's ego has to dissolve. Everyone's ego is just way less important than they thought it was. That's what astronauts said when they saw the Earth from space. They were like, oh my God, all of the petty squabbles seem so small and meaningless, because they are small and meaningless when you just have to change your perspective and see the bigger picture, which is the title of my book. So that was probably the most fundamental one. And then I had many, many very deep personal experiences that really, shifted, my relationships, my sense of intimacy with myself. And a deep lesson I had was that, there's no difference, or let's say there's not a separation between the biographical and like the out there metaphysical stuff that we can experience. They're all interrelated. They're all intertwined. So it's not like Terence McKenna, I think, was wrong in that regard. Terence McKenna was like, no, you ignore all the biographical stuff, and then you just go and get the information from the psychedelic realm and bring it back. You can't ignore the biographical stuff. You have to take it with you, basically, and it informs everything you do and see. And McKenna was, as much as he's probably been one of the most influential people in my life, and I love him, I think he was kind of prone to spiritual bypassing, and I think that that's part of his stuff. Yeah.
Psychedelic bypassing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for sharing. And this is something I've talked about a lot on this podcast, or in general with all the people I've interviewed in my summits, about this deeper connection to one another, to the earth, to understand that everything is a living, breathing being. It's like the connection to Gaia, and like you said, the body, because it's, when we understand that we are all the earth and we are one big body, then we can maybe have a little more compassion. But this world that we're in, it just feels more and more divisive every day. You go on social media, and like we were saying, you're either a narcissist, you're gaslighting, you're wrong. You mentioned the word, if I ever mention the word money, which once in a while I do, I just get completely taken down. And I find it really funny, because again, I'm like, well, isn't that bypassing if we can't just state what's actually here in front of us in this world, even though we might not agree with how certain systems are run? And we do all agree that, there's a lot of broken systems that need to be fixed. But I don't know if bashing one another and bypassing is the answer. I mean, I now know people that are getting canceled. People are now being canceled for not speaking up about something.
Wow.
And then if you do speak up about it, and you're not speaking up about what everybody else wants you to speak about, then you're canceled even more. This has actually happened to a few of my friends, and it's been fascinating to watch how much, and by the way, this is within the psychedelic space. So there's people that understand that there is this interconnection, that there is no separation, all is one, blah, blah, blah. But then, in our day-to-day nitty-picky, ego-based realities, we're having people like literally lose friendships and collaborations, and people who are peers just canceling each other. And it's kind of interesting, because I always say, like, well, wait, why are we all in this? Like you mentioned, this bigger picture. But what does this come down to? And do you think this is, I think eventually what's going to happen is there's going to be just a nervous system overload, and people are just going to be like tired from it and just stop. But do you think it's more like, oh, keep doing the psychedelics, and maybe that person in the psychedelic space who canceled someone, maybe they'll find forgiveness and compassion and understanding, which is my hope. But where do you see that going, like with the culture?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, firstly, there's a difference, I think, for me, between canceling, which is a sort of social phenomena, which is based around like a kind of puritanism and status signaling, and really often has very little to do with the issue at hand. It's really just who can gain more status through this signaling. So there's that. And then there's also just people having strife and disagreement, which is going to just happen between human beings, right? And these are, I think, different things, because I think there's often this urge of like, yes, all is one, so we should all, anytime there's an issue, we should enter like a restorative justice process and always try and reach some kind of harmony. I don't actually agree with that. I think sometimes you just need to be able to be like, hey, you know what? In a civilized way, I'm not going to be in contact with this person anymore. And I've had that experience before and would do it again. However, that's different to then like being in this kind of I think the cancel culture thing is worse because that's a kind of social piling on, um, group based kind of energy, right? So I don't think more psychedelics are going to help that. I think what's needed is kind of a recognition that we're all that we're all human, and so this happens. I mean, like, there was a great Reddit thread a few years ago which was what's the pettiest thing you've ever seen in a group you're part of? And my favorite answer was someone said they're in a rock painting club, and there was this woman in the club was using this special glaze on her rocks that was really nice, and everyone kept asking her what the glaze was, and she wouldn't tell them. so, so that was like the big drama in the rock painting group, right? And I always remember that being like, yeah, we all have these dramas, right? Mm-hmm. But I think what the key thing is that we can work through them in a way that or try to work through them. Sometimes things are not work throughable. I've had that experience. But if they are work throughable, then to work through them in a way that's generative, that actually leads to, okay, we disagree about this thing, but I'll be over here doing this. And then there's still some kind of form of collaboration that can happen. So, some sense of a wider purpose. The problem in the psychedelic community, or a problem, is that we don't really have a shared sense of value. People will often be like, oh, we're all like want the same thing. And I'm like, I don't know if that's true. I think we all want very different things. Some people want the same thing, but I think we all have different visions. It's a lot easier if there's like a meteorite heading towards Earth, and it's like, okay, we all want the same thing for sure. We want the same thing. But in psychedelics, there's so many different options. There's cognitive liberty people, there's clinicians, there's people running retreats, there's people who, there's just like a lot of different voices. And I think overall it finds its way, right? I think it kind of finds its way, but it requires a kind of, I think more so than the big peak experiences of we're all one. That's like, okay, that's a kind of a deep spiritual realization that can really impact our lives. I think what's more interesting is the kind of work that, for example, like Leo Rosman and Sami Awad have done with Israeli and Palestinian groups drinking ayahuasca together and looking at like, how do you actually create protocols for that kind of process? That's where I think the really interesting thing is, where you actually engage with the political, engage with the social. Don't try because what often happens is that the spiritual takes the place of the political. It's like, oh, let's not get political because that's really low vibration. We don't want to do it. I'm like, no, that's life. That's absolutely what's real. What's real in the space is politics, culture, our emotions, our relationality. That's real. The other thing's real too. Deep metaphysical wow experiences are also real, but that's not what we're doing day to day. We're just trying to get on with each other, and build things together. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing this. I know you only have a few minutes left, and thank you for shedding light on that, because there's a lot of either the argument of like, let's bypass the whole thing or let's just write everybody off. But, I come from a more of a Buddhist background of how do we actually find understanding and compassion and learn how to just navigate being human together? Because, I think there's a lot of this hope that we'll all be on the same page one day. And I don't believe that is going to happen on this planet. I mean, I don't know, not unless there's just a non-dual world that we permanently live in forever and ever.
But how boring would that be?
I know. That's actually, it's so funny. I've had so many conversations with people about like, that would just be so boring.
Yeah, exactly.
We have to have the grief in order to experience the beauty and the love and the understanding. And but I want to leave you time to talk about what's next. I know you've had some really amazing courses out there. I almost signed up for one of them, and of course I regret not doing so. But yeah, what's next since you've let go of Rebel Wisdom? You're writing a lot. You have some courses. You're still involved in Breaking Convention, yes?
Yep. Yeah. So that's still ongoing. We have our big conference next year in 2025 in April. We have a one-day event which sold out really quickly. So thank you for everyone who's coming. And there's live stream tickets for that though, still available on April 20th. So that's going on. Yeah, writing. I'm running a big psychedelic super conference in May through Conscious Life. So I've been doing a lot of interviews for that and just speaking to people. We should talk for that, actually. That'd be cool. So yeah, so that's kind of ramping up now as that kind of the time gets nearer, which is a lot of fun, speaking to a lot of people in the space. And then courses. Yeah, no, I'm running right now 8 weeks into a 10-week course that I'm running called New Ways of Knowing, which is really about taking a lot of the insights from that I think are most valuable from the psychedelic experience into how do we navigate complexity, how do we tap into new ways of knowing, how can non-ordinary ways of seeing the world help us to gain a new lens on the world and each other. So I've got lots of really great teachers like John Vervaeke and Nora Bateson and Jim Rutt and Jonathan Rouse, and lots of people in complexity studies, Sophie Strand, people in myth. I mean, just like, it's a great faculty. So that's been running, and I'm going to keep doing more that course again and other courses like it. I just love that. Yes. Yeah.
That's the one I almost signed up for,
Yes.
and I regretted it. I think there was some time conflict I couldn't do, but
Yeah, that's
please run
often
it
that
again.
happens. So I run them. I'll run it one more time this year in the autumn as well, and then a few other courses. I'm also training as a breathwork teacher, so I've been doing a lot of breathwork case studies. Yeah, so that's also something I'm up to. Yeah.
Have you hit the full DMT state with breath work yet?
No, I haven't. I hope I don't, actually. Kind of terrifying. But no, but I've had some really beautiful. I mean, I think breathwork is just so incredible. Breathwork can be as powerful as psychedelics. It just works differently. It's very, very cathartic and really just gets right to the heart of what's going on emotionally, somatically. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Mm. I'm so glad you're up to this. Well, Alexander, let me know when you launch that course again. I'm happy to share it around because I was like, wow, why don't more people know about this? I would love to get more people in that course, maybe
Yeah,
even clients of mine, so we could actually do it all together. So please
awesome.
let me know when it
Yeah,
relaunches.
we'll do.
And thank you so much for your work, and this being a voice of sensemaking and some reason out there in the world. I agree with you completely. There's nothing like the education. And I think this is what we all need is just, discernment, education, really turning inward and, trying to have a little more compassion and understanding for this life that is being human in 2024. It's really intense. So
Amen to that. Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Beth. It's been, as always, a real pleasure. Thank you for this.